this video, we're going to talk about important elements of communication style. When I say communication style, I mean the meta messages that contextualize how listeners are expected to accept or interpret verbal messages. Within that definition is the word meta message. And when we say a meta message, what we really mean is a message about our messages. So communication style is really the communication of a message that lets individuals know how they ought to interpret the messages that that person is supplying individuals with. So that communication style is our meta message. It is the message about the messages that we send. Communication style includes elements of both verbal and nonverbal communication. We're going to talk more about nonverbal communication next time, but we will include some elements of nonverbal style when we talk about those different types of communication style that are important to today's conversation. As we talked about in the last video, I want you to remember that culture is really a lens that helps us determine what we ought to pay attention to and what we ought to ignore in our world. So culture tells us what's important to focus on and what we can let fall out of focus. So culture is that lens, right, that enables us to clearly see things through the lens, but allow everything else that's happening in the environment and everything else that's part of that event to kind of disappear and be something that isn't something that we have to focus all of our attention on. The type of information that an individual uses to assign meaning to a cultural event can help us understand if that individual tends to have a more high context or low context cultural orientation. If that individual prefers high context communication or has a high context culture orientation, that individual utilizes a style of communication where a lot of the information is contained in the context and in the nonverbal cues that are shared rather than expressed explicitly in the words of a situation. When I think of high context communication, a lot of the time I'm reminded of dance. So in dance there are no words, and yet if dancers are talented enough, we can understand the messages that are being conveyed because of the movement and because of the expressions that the dancers utilize, as well as the music playing. So in the video we're about to watch, the two dancers will experience them falling in love, but only through their movements and only through the music that accompanies those movements rather than the words inherent in the interaction. So just as the dancers in the video were able to convey the emotions associated with falling in love and being in love through their movement rather than the words that they used, individuals of a high context culture do the same thing. So in interactions with people from high context cultures, the vast majority of the information that's important to understanding that event is communicated without words. Countries that tend to prefer high context communication styles include Japan, China, and Korea. In high context cultures, there tend to be a lot of similarities among the people, and it's because of these similarities that the individuals within high context cultures tend to have similar perceptions, similar experiences, and similar societal expectations. These similarities make it easier for people in high context cultures to interpret those messages that are more reliant on the context than on the actual words that individuals are saying. Additionally, these cultures tend not to change a lot over time, and this enables that high context communication to occur and to be more easily understood by all people, as the contextual meanings that are associated with events don't tend to change across generations. Note how high context cultures coincide with collective cultures. So when a group gets precedence over the individual, those who comprise the groups are able to stay more similar, and the meanings of the contextual clues can be more easily shared from one group to the other group, or from one generation to the next generation. When individuality is the prize trait, cultural meanings have the potential to vary greatly from person to person. As such, it becomes more appropriate for cultural meanings to be expressed explicitly and verbally rather than non-verbally and within the context of a situation. Low context communication is a style of communication in which much of the information is conveyed in words rather than in nonverbal cues or in nonverbal contact. As I just said, individualistic countries tend to be low context cultures. This is because when individuality is expressed, people don't have a large number of shared experiences. And as such, a lot of the information that's needed to accurately convey the meaning of a message comes from the individual. So it doesn't come from a shared repository of ideas or a shared repository of experiences. The United States tends to be a low context culture, and as such, much of what we expect people to pay attention to are the words that we're saying rather than the nonverbal communication that we have associated with those words, or the contextual clues that indicate how things ought to be perceived in a particular context. In low context cultures, the person who can clearly and concisely share a verbal message is considered a competent communicator and a credible communicator. In high context cultures, however, a competent communicator is someone who is aware of the information needed to understand the message without any words being exchanged. So individuals who need to share fewer words to understand the meaning in a context are considered more competent and more credible communicators in high context situations. Our communication style can also be considered direct or indirect. A direct style of communication is where speakers reveal their true intentions, needs, wants, and desires through the explicit verbal communication that they utilize. In the United States, we value and thus utilize a more direct style, so we prefer written contracts that explicitly articulate the terms of an agreement. In business settings, communicators who can clearly, concisely, and directly communicate meaning are more apt to be promoted than individuals who struggle with being direct. As might make sense, direct communicators tend to be low context communicators. So the verbal message is what's prioritized, and those verbal messages ought to be clearly and directly communicated to conversational and cultural others. So in the comic on the screen, the student is able to clearly understand what's wrong with his paper because of the direct communication being supplied by his professor. Notice how this direct style might lead to hurt feelings, which could damage their relationship. Thus, when people are aiming to protect the harmony in a relationship, they may resort to a more indirect style of communication. An indirect style is where the speaker's true intentions, needs, wants, and desires are camouflaged by the words that are used in their verbal messages. With indirect communication, value is placed on preserving the relationship. So it's understood that there are many times when individuals might not want to communicate directly with a conversational other because direct communication might cause individuals to become emotionally injured. Thus, individuals with an indirect style might talk around an issue so that they can help the other keep face. In this comic, instead of making his wife feel angry by telling her that he lost his job, the man decides to indirectly let her know that he was fired by simply indicating that he'll be spending more time with the family. The message framed in this way isn't exactly truthful, but might, in his opinion at least, promote peace in his marriage by keeping that fight from happening. While I stated that the U.S. tends to favor a direct style, do know that there's variability in how and when we choose to employ directness and or indirectness. Because we can make these choices depending on what is favored in the individual cultures to which we belong, we might see problems arise in relationships because each person might be placing a different value on things like honesty, which requires direct communication, and harmony, which often requires indirect communication. So again, I only give this little snippet to remind us that within cultures there is variability in how people employ directness and indirectness, as well as high and low context cues. So just because I'll say that the US tends to be low context and it tends to be direct, that is true of the culture at large, but do recognize that individuals within that culture are going to value different communication styles in different contexts. The final communication style we're going to talk about is either an elaborate or an understated style. Elaborate speakers use rich and expressive language in their everyday speech. These speakers are going to utilize a lot of metaphor when they're interacting with other people. Understated speakers, on the other hand, tend to use simple assertions as well as silence to communicate their messages. So those are a variety of ways we can describe our communication style within our cultures. A final thing to remember is that there are individual, contextual, and relational differences concerning the communication styles that people utilize. A couple in the United States might be high context communicators within their relationship. For example, my husband and I have been together for 6 years, and we've been married for almost 2 of those years. While we haven't been married that long, we're able to understand one another without explicitly asking the other a question. So I know what kind of mood he's in, and thus I know how I ought to respond to his messages based on how he comes home from work and how he interacts with me right after he gets home. Thus, even though we're in the US where a more low context style tends to be favored, we develop a more high context style as we share experiences within our relationship. Once we have more shared experiences that we can utilize as a frame for looking at the world, our thoughts don't need to be expressed as explicitly to one another because we'll have that wealth of shared experiences that help us understand the meaning inherent in our relationship and inherent in the context in which we find ourselves without necessarily utilizing words.